It is early morning, 1935. Somewhere in America. It could be a farmhouse in Ohio, a row house in Philadelphia, a bungalow outside Fresno. A woman is standing at a stove that has already been lit for 20 minutes because the stove is slow, and she has learned exactly how slow. There is no refrigerator humming in the corner, just a cooler box, an ice box if the family is lucky, and a pantry with careful spacing between the jars, because those jars will be needed again. A child pulls on a coat with a patch at the elbow that doesn't quite match the rest of the fabric, but nobody in this kitchen notices, because half the coats on the street look the same way. A shirt hangs near the stove, drying. It has been mended at the collar. Twice. Nothing dramatic is happening here. No crisis. No catastrophe. Just a family doing what it does every single morning. Measuring, mending, reusing, stretching. And that is exactly the point. This was survival, built from thousands of small, unremarkable decisions. Decisions so ordinary that almost nobody thought to write them down. So here is the question this film is going to ask. What did ordinary families in 1935 understand about money and survival that many households today have almost completely forgotten? And a warning before we go further. This isn't a story about becoming wealthy. It's a story about what it took simply to endure. Because some of the knowledge this country lost wasn't about getting ahead. It was about not falling behind when the money ran short. Chapter 1. The household that couldn't afford to waste. By 1935, the United States was 6 years into an economic collapse that had touched nearly every household in the country, whether directly or by proximity. Unemployment remained painfully high. Bank failures earlier in the decade had wiped out savings for families who thought they'd done everything right. Wages that hadn't disappeared entirely had often been cut. And even households with steady income lived with the knowledge that steady could change overnight. This documentary is not going to tell you that everyone in 1935 was miserable, nor that everyone was equally poor. That would be false. Farm families, factory families, immigrant families, and professional families all experienced the decade differently, and the severity of hardship varied enormously by region, race, and circumstance. Black families and other households already facing discrimination in employment and lending were frequently hit hardest, with the fewest safety nets to fall back on. What was widely shared across most of these different experiences was a particular relationship to money and material goods. A relationship built less around what something cost to buy, and more around what it would cost you over time. A cheap pair of shoes that fell apart in 2 months was not, by the standards of the day, actually cheap. A slightly more expensive pair that could be resoled by a local cobbler again and again was often understood as the better economic choice, even when the upfront cost stung more. This is where our story really begins, not with poverty as spectacle, but with poverty as a teacher of arithmetic. The kind of arithmetic that asked one quiet, persistent question before almost every purchase. What will this actually cost me, over its whole life? That question shaped decisions about clothing, tools, furniture, food, and household goods. And it is, largely, a question modern households have stopped asking. Chapter 2. The art of making $1 behave like two household budgeting in this era was rarely abstract. It was physical. Home economics bulletins circulated by the U.S. Department of Agriculture's Bureau of Home Economics, along with materials from state agricultural extension services, routinely offered guidance on dividing limited income across the categories that mattered most: shelter, food, fuel, clothing, medical needs, and savings, however small. Some families used the envelope method, dividing cash into labeled envelopes for rent, food, coal, and so on, a practice documented in period household management literature, though it's worth noting the exact terminology and popularity of envelope budgeting as a named system is more associated with later decades. In the 1930s, the underlying practice of physically separating money by purpose was common even where the specific vocabulary wasn't. Extension bulletins and women's magazines like Ladies' Home Journal and Woman's Home Companion published detailed weekly menus built around the cheapest nutritionally adequate staples: beans, potatoes, cornmeal, milk when affordable, and whatever vegetables were in season or preserved from summer. These weren't just recipes. They were survival math dressed up as domestic advice. Shopping itself became a discipline. Planning a list before entering a store, rather than buying reactively, was widely promoted specifically because impulse purchases, even small ones, were understood to quietly drain a fixed and fragile income. Comparison shopping between local grocers, watching for seasonal price drops, and buying in bulk when a good price appeared were not lifestyle choices. They were the difference between making it to the next payday and not. The deeper lesson buried in all of this wasn't really about finding rock-bottom prices. It was about avoiding repeated expenses. A one-time cost, however painful, was preferable to a recurring one. That distinction, one-time versus recurring, sat underneath almost every financial decision a Depression-era household made. Have you ever thought about how many of your own monthly expenses are recurring costs that a 1935 household would have gone to enormous lengths to avoid? Chapter 3. Nothing was just old attempts. If there is one section of this story that reveals just how deep this knowledge ran, it is the culture of repair. Mending was not a hobby. It was infrastructure. Darning socks, rebuilding a worn heel or toe by weaving new thread through the hole using a wooden darning egg, was a skill taught to most girls, and often boys, as a basic household competency, not a craft project. A sock with a hole was not garbage. It was a sock that needed 20 minutes of attention. Worn adult clothing frequently had a second life. A father's outgrown or worn work trousers might be cut down and re-sewn into clothing for a younger child. Flour and feed sacks, printed with patterns specifically so they could be repurposed, were commonly turned into dresses, aprons, and children's clothing. A practice well documented in rural households throughout the decade, and one that manufacturers eventually leaned into by printing more attractive fabric designs on their sacks, anticipating exactly this reuse. Buttons were saved obsessively, kept in tins or jars, because buying new buttons for a garment that could otherwise be mended was considered an avoidable expense. Scrap fabric became quilts, patches, and rags. Nothing woven was thrown away while it still held together. Furniture was mended rather than replaced. A wobbly chair leg got re-glued. A broken drawer got refitted. Tool blades were sharpened repeatedly rather than discarded once dull. A whetstone was a common household item, and knowing how to use one was ordinary knowledge, not a specialized skill. Shoes were resoled, not replaced, for as long as a local cobbler or a home shoe repair kit could manage it. Home shoe repair kits, sold specifically to help families resole their own shoes without paying a cobbler, were a real and commercially available product of the period. None of this was viewed as impressive. It was viewed as normal. And that is the crucial detail. These were not exceptional acts of frugality. They were baseline expectations. Every mended sock, every recut pair of trousers, every re-glued chair leg represented a purchase that didn't have to happen. What if the real skill being lost today isn't the sewing or the sharpening? It's simply the instinct to try repairing something before assuming it's disposable. Chapter 4. The kitchen that threw almost nothing away. Nowhere was the make it last philosophy more visible than in the kitchen, though it's important to be precise about what was and wasn't universal here. Rural households with land often had gardens, and some kept chickens or a hog, giving them access to fresh produce and meat that urban families frequently lacked. Home canning, preserving fruits, vegetables, and sometimes meat in glass jars using a water bath or pressure canner was extremely widespread in rural and semi-rural America, promoted heavily by agricultural extension services and documented extensively in period canning bulletins. Urban households, by contrast, were more dependent on what they could buy, though many still canned when they had access to affordable seasonal produce or a community garden plot. Stale bread was rarely discarded. It became bread pudding, was used to thicken soups, or was dried into crumbs for later cooking. Bones from a roast or a ham were routinely simmered into stock for soup, a practice that stretched a single piece of meat across multiple meals. Vegetable scraps often went into the same simmering pot. Meal planning around leftovers wasn't a modern rebranding of an old idea. It was the original idea. Sunday's roast became Monday's hash, and Monday's hash became Tuesday's soup. Portions were measured with real attention because an oversized serving one night could mean an undersized meal later in the week. Pickling and drying, in addition to canning, extended the usable life of vegetables and fruit well beyond their growing season, particularly in regions where canning equipment was expensive or hard to access, and drying required less specialized equipment. It's worth being direct here. Not every household could do all of this. Families without land, without storage space, or without the fuel to run a canner for hours had far fewer preservation options and often relied more heavily on what could be bought cheaply and used immediately. The knowledge existed broadly, but access to the resources needed to apply it did not. Still, the underlying attitude was close to universal. Food waste wasn't primarily a moral failing or an environmental concern in the way we might frame it today. It was simply money, thrown in the trash. How many American households were actually stretching food this way? And how quickly did that instinct disappear once groceries became cheap and abundant again? Chapter 5. The knowledge that was never written down here is something easy to miss about this entire body of knowledge. Most of it was never formally recorded, because nobody thought it needed to be. A mother taught a daughter how to turn a worn dress into something wearable for another year. A father showed a son how to resole a boot, or how to tell when a tool was worth sharpening versus worth discarding. A neighbor walked another neighbor through her canning process the first time she tried it herself. An older relative explained, almost in passing, which purchases held their value and which ones didn't. None of this made it into official histories. Home economics bulletins captured some of it. The canning instructions, the budgeting worksheets, the nutrition guidance. But a great deal of the finer, more intuitive knowledge lived entirely in oral tradition, passed from person to person inside individual households. It was considered too ordinary to document. Nobody in 1935 thought they were preserving a vanishing skill. They thought they were simply teaching their children how life worked. This raises the deeper question sitting underneath this entire documentary. What happens to knowledge when every generation assumes the next one will simply absorb it automatically? Sometimes it turns out nobody does. Chapter 6. The Forgotten Survival Method. If this documentary has a single thesis, it's this one, and it's simpler than any individual technique we've covered so far. Make it last. Not as a slogan, as an operating question, asked instinctively, before almost every transaction a household made. Could this be repaired instead of replaced? Could something already owned do the job instead of buying something new? Could this purchase be postponed a week, a month, a season? Could this food be stretched into one more meal? Could this piece of clothing be altered rather than discarded? Could one resource substitute for another that was harder to get or more expensive? This wasn't a single clever trick passed around at church or over a fence. It was a full operating system for an entire household, a lens applied to nearly every decision, large and small. And to be absolutely clear, none of this means modern households should try to replicate 1935 out of some romantic instinct. Nobody should aspire to darn socks by candlelight because it seems virtuous. That's not the lesson. The lesson is about resilience. Specifically, the practical ability to reduce expenses quickly when circumstances demand it, to keep functioning when income changes, to tell the difference between a need and a want under pressure, and to make what you already have work a little longer before reaching for a replacement. That is a transferable skill. It doesn't require a depression to be useful. Chapter 7. When the knowledge started disappearing. This knowledge didn't vanish overnight, and it didn't vanish because anyone made a conscious decision to abandon it. It eroded gradually, over decades, as the conditions that had made it necessary began to change. Post-war economic growth brought rising incomes to much of the American middle class through the 1940s, 50s, and 60s. Mass production made consumer goods dramatically cheaper and more widely available than they had been a generation earlier. Advertising expanded aggressively, and much of it promoted a new relationship with material goods, one built around novelty, convenience, and replacement rather than repair. Convenience foods reduced the time needed for meal preparation, which was a genuine benefit, especially as more women entered paid employment outside the home and total household time for unpaid domestic labor shrank. Supermarkets and department stores replaced smaller local shops, changing how people shopped and how directly they tracked household spending. Disposable products, from razors to diapers to packaging, became normalized as conveniences rather than luxuries. There has been public debate, dating back decades, over the concept of planned obsolescence, the idea that some manufacturers deliberately designed products with shorter lifespans to encourage repeat purchases. The extent and intent behind this practice remain genuinely contested among historians and economists, and this documentary won't claim more certainty than the evidence supports. What is less contested is the broader cultural shift. Repairing something increasingly required specialized tools, replacement parts, or expertise that fewer households retained, while replacing it often became cheaper, faster, and easier than fixing it. None of this was uniformly bad. Many products became safer. Household labor became less physically punishing. Families gained time back. These were real and meaningful gains. But somewhere in that transition, the household calculation quietly flipped. The question that had once been, "How can I make this last?" slowly became, "How easily can I replace it?" What if the most consequential change of the last 90 years wasn't a single invention or policy, but simply this one shift in the question families learned to ask? Somewhere, there's probably a version of this knowledge still alive in your own family. A grandmother who could fix anything with a needle and thread. A grandfather who never threw out a jar. A recipe built entirely from what was left over, not what was bought special. If this film brought one of those memories back, tell us about it in the comments. That knowledge deserves to be written down before it disappears for good. And if you want to keep tracing what else the last century quietly cost us, subscribe. There's more of this story to tell.